Okay, I'm just going to give you a few short videos here on planning in other nations. What I want to do with this first couple slides is just kind of get us to start thinking about how what we've talked about urban planning in the United States is going to be different in other parts of the world. So just the way things are in other countries, politically, socially, geographically, all those kind of different factors are made urban planning different in other nations as compared to the US. So let me just give you a quick couple slides to overview this. So when you're thinking about Western Europe, like planning in Western Europe, World War II caused an enormous amount of destruction in urban areas. And so planning in Western Europe post World War II, I always joke that urban planning and urban studies gets really exciting after World War II. Well, in Europe, what you had is World War II actually a lot of physical destruction. Cities like Berlin, like this photo here, Berlin, bombings just destroying cities. So there's this really big emphasis on rebuilding inner cities. A really big this idea of kind of rebuilding urban places after disaster. A lot of these lessons can be learned from the effects of World War II. Just destroyed, just bombed out cities. So that is one huge force that kind of shaped planning in Western Europe. Then you had the formation of the EC, this idea of the European Union, one European community economically. You know how they have the euro as a form of currency that's shared between many different nations. I mean, even if you just think of that, think of like a euro, their currency. So this idea of kind of a united economic Europe, a bigger European Union that's comprised of many different nations, this kind of unification also influences decisions made about urban planning. Think about it politically. When we've been talking about America, very much a capitalist society. We kind of, our urban planning, our economic development, all of what we do is really within the framework of capitalism, of a capitalist society. So in Europe, you've got some socialism, right? And this is not just political, but this is an ideology. Like it's a force that ideologically shapes how government should be involved. And we talk about that a lot in public policy and urban studies is should government be involved in our lives and how should they be involved? So if you've got a socialist country, that's going to be a different ideology about how government can be involved in our lives, and that includes urban planning on how government can be involved in shaping land and what we do with land and how we build cities and what they look like. So it's a different kind of government, a different just cultural like way of thinking about how government should be involved in something like city planning. So also geographically, European nations have a higher population density. So there's just more people in a smaller space. I mean, that's the reality of it. More people in a smaller space. So there's a lot of emphasis on using land more efficiently than we do here in America and concentrating develop. We talk about, when we talked about early America and urbanization and kind of urban planning came out of some of the troubles we had with urban concentration and density. And so in Western Europe, they've focused more on using land efficiently, concentrating development. And what this means is that you don't have as much of this sprawly kind of urban sprawl, suburban thing in Europe that we have in America. So, and then really just different kinds of government. The European government has more power over the control of private property. When we talked in some of our earlier lessons in this class about the American Revolution and how after the American Revolution, town planning in the US changed because the government didn't really have a lot of control over private property. In the US, our Constitution has a lot of safeguards for private property, for individualism, individual freedom, protecting private property. Those rights are really strong in America, whereas over in Europe, the European government just really has more power and control over private property than what you see here in the US. So just kind of continuing with this overview of how, just an example of how planning formed differently in other places. So still in Western Europe, they have less reliance on the courts than you do in the US. So over there, there's less fear of courts reversing land decisions. You can, kind of imagine how a lot of issues in the US are decided in court. The legal fights, the law, the court makes the decision about maybe like a land use dispute. Whereas in Western Europe, this is going to be handled administratively. So a government kind of administration is going to settle those land use disputes. Whereas in America, we would settle a land use dispute in court. We go to court, the judge would decide. So also, what's really interesting is that when we talk about housing, public housing in the US, Europe has a substantial amount of publicly built and owned housing. They may call it social housing. This idea that the government housing, they build it, a lot more of it, they own housing, whereas in America that hasn't been the case. Real estate development, housing is very much the activity of the private market. It's private, it's not a government thing. Government has only delved, in the US, has only delved a little bit into public housing projects, subsidies for public housing, but really Europeans government builds a lot of housing, whereas in the US they do not. Europe also has large amounts of public land, whereas in America a lot of the land is privately owned. It's just not the case in Europe. Europe has a lot of land that the government owns. So if the government owns it, the government can control and decide what to do with it, how to develop it, and as you know, urban planning is very much a government function. So another kind of cultural difference is in Europe, middle and upper class citizens, they like living in apartments in central cities. Whereas in America, culturally, there's this history of suburbanization. So where the middle and upper classes are leaving the inner city, they're leaving the central cities with the small apartments, and it's like the middle and upper class in America, culturally, it's like they want the big house with the big yard and living out in these kind of suburban communities, big house, big yard. You have your automobile, whatever this kind of 1950s version of the American dream you guys might have in mind. The difference in Europe is you've got your middle and upper classes. They like living in these apartments in central cities. And so that affects planning as well. Just a couple more points before we wrap up here is that Europe has the political power is much more centralized. So the local plans would have to be in compliance with the national plan. In the US, we don't really have a national plan. I mean, other than like the federal highway system that was built. It's not like the federal government, all of America, has one master plan for America. It's more of our government structure is that each city, each local municipality has to answer to the state. So all of our 50 states, each state government, that's just kind of the distribution of power, is that that the cities are the creatures of the state. So we don't have centralized political power, right? It's all these different cities, all these different towns, all these different little local municipalities make their own plans. They make their own master plan, and they have the power to do so. So it's not like they have to be in compliance with the national plan. But in Europe, you see that. In Europe, part of it is because it's physically much smaller, so it's easier to have a national plan that kind of governs all these other local plans. So yeah, so those are some of the kind of big differences, I guess, just in comparing the US to Western Europe and all these different types of forces that would have made urban planning different in other nations. And so in the next couple slides, we'll look at, in the next presentation, just a couple different cities in Europe and kind of what their planning goals are.